So in this video, I'm going to talk about how systems are so hard to manage. And this might give you some insight into the complexity of ecological systems, but also the complexity of social, perhaps, and even economic systems. So one of the reasons why systems are so hard to manage is that some of the variables might be unpredictable. So we have unpredictability. So many variables can be predicted, and maybe there's not a lot of variation in those variables. So for example, we might be able to predict the amount of sunlight that is hitting a given part of the planet. So when we talk about unpredictable variables, we talk about those variables having had stochastic behavior. So stochastic behavior. So this means that there is an element of uncertainty about them. So for example, we could talk about all of the unknowns when we talk about climate change and our system, our whole global system of attempting to maintain a relatively constant environment. So that would be an element. There's lots of elements of uncertainty in that. We can also talk about the complexity of a system. So more complex systems have more storages and more flows. So as we increase the complexity of system, then that makes it more difficult to manage. A third one would be the hierarchy in the system. So we might be able to look at the individual components and understand them, but when we put those components together, they might create something new. So you might have heard of the biological hierarchy in other classes where we talk about molecules like proteins and then cells, and how cells are composed of molecules. But when we look at the individual molecules, we cannot explain what happens when those molecules come together and form a cell and create something that is alive. And so as we move up this hierarchy, we start to get these variables that just cannot be explained by the characteristics of the components. And then there's a fourth one, in that some systems have what is called a time lag. And so this means that a change in a variable might be not seen, the effect of that change in a variable might not be seen until a while after. And maybe it is even difficult to make the connections between that change in the variable here and then the response over here. So making those connections over periods of time might be difficult. And then finally, we have distance effects. So the fifth one would be distance effects. So this is the idea that some of these changes that we're making in our environment might not have its effect where the change is being made, but it might have a much greater effect somewhere else. So you could talk about climate change and how it's the industrial countries, maybe in the temperate region of the planet, that are producing the CO2, but the distance, the effect of it is that climate change is much greater in the polar regions than it is where we are producing it. So that looking at how that distance, physical distance, not time distance, but physical distance, can make understanding and managing systems more difficult. So let's just look at some examples of these. So in this particular example, we're talking about a variable, which is the amount of rainfall. And so in Niger versus Sudan, the amount of rainfall differs in its predictability and also in its distribution. So in Niger, there is a longer growing season where we have a period of rain. And so in that particular environment, at that region, we can have farming because the rainfall is predictable. When we look at in Sudan, the rainfall actually happens in 2 seasons. And so because we don't have the ability to store the water and to irrigate, then they have a whole different system. So for example, they rely upon herding animals in order to feed their people. So these are 2 places kind of in the same region of the planet, but that have very different characteristics. This is an example of how we can look at distance, but also time lag effects. So the pH of lake water stays relatively constant. So you can see here that this is pretty predictable, right? So we can make some predictions about that. However, when we add a new variable, which is the emission of sulfur, because of manufacturing plants releasing sulfur into the atmosphere, then you can see that this is going to cause a dramatic change in this variable. Now, interestingly, there is a time lag. So notice that sulfur emissions start to increase way back in the 1900s, but we don't start to see a change in the pH of the lakes until like 1955, the late 1950s. And so one of the things that helped to maintain a relatively constant pH in our lakes was the fact that we had a buffering system to help to maintain homeostasis. And that buffering system became overwhelmed at about right here, right, where we start to see a dramatic decrease in the pH of the water. So the water is becoming more acidic. So then we start to see how this is affecting the populations of fish in that lake. And so this is an important example. This is time lag, but it could also be distance. So that factory could be somewhere else, and it could be releasing that emission into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere does not know political boundaries, right? It does not pay attention to that. And so it can go anywhere. Once we release stuff into the atmosphere, it could end up anywhere in our global pattern because of the circulation of our atmosphere. So a good example of this is what they call the Grasshopper Effect. So you could, as a country, like for example, Canada, you could ban certain chemicals from being emitted into your atmosphere, but because of this distance effect, those chemicals could rain down on you and could cause problems. So for example, if we're looking at a real volatile chemical that's released, it is actually going to jump further, because volatile means that it is taken up into the atmosphere more readily. So we could have the release of toxic chemicals like dioxin, which is released during the production of bleaching process, and PCBs and mercury. All of those could go into the atmosphere at the equatorial region, and then they could jump to the temperate regions. Or we could produce chemicals in our temperate regions and they could jump to the polar regions. So chemicals that are not even produced by people in the polar regions in the Arctic end up in their environment and in the organisms that reside there because of this distance effect. Less volatile ones tend to jump less, right, or at shorter distance, but they can also end up in regions where they have been banned. So this is really important idea, because it is not simply enough to have like individual countries controlling air pollution, because that air pollution gets up into the atmosphere and travels.